Okay, here we are, April 7th, 2020, and I and the students of journalism at Eastern Nazarene College want to welcome you, Tony Messenger, as our guest speaker today. Tony will be speaking to us about the writing journey that led him to win the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for commentary, which will feature insights that can raise the bar on your own reporting, column writing, and can be applied to any genre of writing. I want to share a brief bio about Tony Messenger. Tony Messenger is the St. Louis Post-Dispatch's Metro columnist, writing 4 columns a week in a position that he has held since September 2016. His past roles have included editorial page editor, Capital correspondent, and political columnist. His awards before his 2019 Pulitzer Prize include the 2016 Missouri Medal of Honor, the national headliner for editorial writing, and in 2015, he was a Pulitzer Prize finalist and recipient of the Sigma Delta Chi Award for Best Editorials of the Year by the Society of Professional Journalists, among numerous other awards. Thank you, Tony, for being with us today.
Thank you. Good to see you, Suzette. Been a while.
Yes, it's been a while, Tony. Can everybody hear him? You seem a little, the volume seems a little low, Tony.
Okay, let me see if I can see what I can do here. Hold on.
Okay, oh, now you just muted yourself. There you go, Tony.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see.
Yes. Okay, so let me start you off with a question. In 2018, you wrote a series of columns that changed law and policy in Missouri. Can you share with us the story idea that sparked your journey to the Pulitzer Prize?
Sure. So the interesting thing about my Debtor's Prison series is that it started kind of accidentally. I had written a column about a woman named Victoria Branson, who had been sent to prison in a tiny little county called St. Francis County over an old child support case. And she had, her ex-husband had already died. The son was already grown. She thought the case was long over. And it turns out that the judge had been continuing to try to raise money from her court case for years. And she didn't realize, because she had moved away, that she still owed money in this county. And so she ended up getting arrested on a small little thing. She had moved back to St. Francis County, and the police ran her name, and it turned out she had this old child support case. Well, she didn't have the money to pay it, and the judge sent her to prison. I wrote about that case because that judge had been overturned 2 or 3 times by the Supreme Court for violating the Constitution by sending people to prison because they couldn't afford court costs. And Victoria Branson ended up getting released from prison. Well, what I didn't realize at the time was that the biggest part of her court costs was for jail time. So in Missouri, as in most states in the country, it is legal for cities and counties to charge for time in jail, meaning you go to jail on a misdemeanor or some minor charge, and you get out of jail, you've served your time, then the county sends you a bill, and you owe money for that time in jail. Well, it adds up really quickly, and 80% of the folks who go spend time in a county jail or a municipal jail are poor people. They're being defended by the public defender. They don't have a lot of money. They have minimum wage jobs, etc. That's the common reality of the folks that we put in jail in this country. And then they get this bill for jail. Well, they can't afford to pay it. And what I found out in 2017 and 2018 and 2019 was that folks were being put back in jail all around Missouri because they couldn't afford to pay this bill. So one of the key people that I wrote about was this woman named Brooke Bergen. And the reason that she was so key to the entire series was because of a mistake that I made. So I had sent an email to defense attorneys, public defenders, people that I knew in the legal profession, and I said, I'm looking into these cases, these folks who have been sent to jail because they can't afford their previous jail bill. Send me the most egregious cases you've come across. And one of them sent me the court file of this Brooke Bergen. She had stolen an $8 tube of mascara from a Walmart in Salem, Missouri. It's in Dent County in the middle part of the state, very rural area. And she had been charged, arrested, in jail for a few days because she couldn't afford the bail, gets out, and she's awaiting trial. And during the time that she's awaiting trial, she's got to answer to this private probation company that has a contract with the county. And they decide that they're going to drug test her. The judge says, yeah, you can drug test her. The charge has nothing to do with drugs, but Brooke, like a lot of people in that region, happens to have some drug issues. She misses a drug test. They put her in jail for a probation violation. She still hasn't even been convicted on her crime yet. Anyway, to make that whole long story about Brooke a little bit shorter, she ends up spending a year in jail over alleged probation violations related to this $8 misdemeanor shoplifting charge. And she gets a bill that ends up being over $15,000 for this time in jail. Well, she's never going to be able to afford that. And month after month, the judge would call her before the court. And if she had money to pay, she wouldn't have to go to jail. If she didn't have money, she'd go back to jail. So I get sent this information about her file. And at the time, I thought, this is a simple number story. People will be deeply offended by $8. I stole an $8 tube of mascara, and I'm going to end up owing $15,000. That's just not just. People get that. That doesn't make any sense. So I try to call a couple of the numbers on the court file for Brooke. I can't get a hold of her. And, but I'm like, I've got all the court files. I've got everything I need as a journalist really to write this story. And I wrote the story, and it was a good column, gets published. People are deeply offended. The next day after it publishes, I get a Facebook message from Brooke Bergen. And I'm horrified. As soon as I see the name and I see the message, I'm horrified, because what do we do in the age of social media as journalists? We try to find people on social media. You know, we can't necessarily get them on their email, can't necessarily get them on their phone number. Here's the reality of poor people. They change their phone numbers all the time. Can't afford, you know, they have a phone with this company and they can't afford the bill, and then they switch to another company, etc. Happens all the time. And so Brooke Bergen sends me this Facebook message. Oh, I was surprised to see my case, you know, in the paper like this, but she wasn't upset. She was happy that somebody got it. She's like, all of us who spend time in the jail in Dent County realize this is awful. And we talk about it amongst ourselves, and nobody cares because they just think we're all criminals. And they all have this sort of philosophy. Well, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. And nobody actually understands what's really going on, that they're really in jail because they're poor, not because they're criminals. So she tells me this story, and it turns out that Brooke has this just really interesting backstory of how she got into poverty and how the drug charges were helping to keep her poor, and she had a hard time breaking her addiction, etc. And I went down to Dent County to meet Brooke and go to court with her, and she helped introduce me to this whole other group of mostly single women like her living in poverty, some of which had drug problems, some of which didn't, who were being abused by the system. And they were just packing this tiny little county jail with third world conditions, with people that were all there mostly just because they were poor, and they were losing access to their children. They were losing their apartments, their homes, their cars, their jobs, everything. It was devastating to their lives. And so it was a mistake I made, not working harder to get in touch with Brooke, that really made this series happen. Because after I went down there and talked to Brooke and met her other friends that she got to know in jail, those were the personal stories that I started telling so that people understood this real bad problem within criminal justice reform, that this was about an abuse of poor people, that this was about civil rights violations, criminal justice reform, all sorts of things, but mostly it was about trampling on the rights of people who were living in poverty, who had no ability to get out from that poverty because the system was keeping them down. And I think that's what really made the series happen. It's what drew the attention of lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats, who realized this just doesn't make sense. This isn't just. And over the next year, both the state legislature passed a law that says you can't do this anymore, and the Supreme Court issued a ruling on a couple of these cases that says, no, this is illegal. You can't put people in jail because they can't afford to pay a jail bill. The sad thing is people are still being charged for their time in jail. I think that's unconstitutional. That's sort of another avenue that I'm going to keep pursuing in terms of, perhaps getting rid of this charge altogether. So why don't I stop there a little bit, Suzette, and let's sort of see what sort of questions we have and go wherever it needs to go.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Tony directly right now? Well, certainly I have one. When you talked about how it started as a column and then you met all these other people and a bigger story started to emerge, did you have an end result in mind, a call of action, or did you feel that your focus was doing a full-on expose as much as possible? I mean, did you start from the beginning when you started to see this open up? Did you feel the call of action from the very beginning was like, let's change the law?
No, it took me a while. I was probably 5 or 6 columns in before I really realized that there was a chance to do something really serious here. What I started doing is I would write about one person in one county, one particular bad judge or whatever, and then all of a sudden, I get emails and calls from people that say, hey, that happened to me in this county. That happened to me over here. And so I would just keep following these cases. And so I was just following them and following them and following them before something ended up building. It wasn't until a state lawmaker called me and said, I want to file a bill about this and I want to really get something done, that I realized, you know what, there's a call of action here. There's something that we can do about this. We can drive, public action this particular year. And so there were really sort of then 2 sort of tracks at that point, because at that point I start writing about the legislation and hoping that I can have an effect on that. In the meantime, the court cases are making their way through the court system, and the court sort of works on its own schedule. And all of a sudden the Supreme Court elevates this topic as well, and moves it forward and says, we're going to deal with these cases. And so they ended up on parallel tracks, which was kind of nice. I mean, it doesn't usually happen that way. And as that stuff started happening, I just realized this is a unique opportunity. And I was not the only person, but almost the only person in the state covering this particular story. And I just said, I told my editors, I said, I'm just going to keep doing this and keep driving. And it ended up being the primary thing that I wrote about in 2018.
You brought to the public's attention something so egregious and obvious. It kind of makes me wonder why the judges didn't see this going on at the time and they were just going along with this.
So the judges in rural Missouri are elected. As they are in a lot of different places. And the most powerful people in a small county are the county sheriff and the locally elected judges. and they end up, as well as the prosecutor, really those three, they end up on the same sort of track where you don't elect a sheriff unless he says, I'm tough on crime. And so the judge, I'm tough on crime too. But here's where it gets really complicated. The reason that they're charging that jail bill and then other fines and fees that are associated with the criminal justice system is to make money for the county. Because most of these rural counties are conservative Republican counties, and they don't like taxes. And so they don't want to raise taxes on themselves. They don't want to raise sales taxes. They don't want to raise property taxes. They don't want to have a tax to pay for roads and all that. So instead, they just charge these court fees. And they don't have to go to a vote of the people to charge the court fees. And who's paying them? Poor people that the court and the system is labeling as criminals. They aren't really criminals. They're our neighbors who happen to occasionally make a mistake. They pay the price for their mistake, and then all of a sudden they're tied to this system forever. One of the cases that I wrote about that really got a lot of attention was this kid named Corey Booth. He was 17 when he stole a lawnmower. He's a 17-year-old kid. He and his buddy steal a lawnmower from this grandmother's yard. Turns out it doesn't work. They returned the lawnmower before they ever got arrested. They're like, yeah, this is dumb. This isn't going to work. They take it back. But the woman reports a stolen lawnmower. The police end up at somebody's house. They say, yeah, Corey did it. They go to Corey. They say, yeah, I stole the lawnmower. So they arrest him. They put him in jail. He tells me this story. He was in jail overnight with a guy being held on felony bank robbery. And so he's a 17-year-old kid in jail with this bank robber, freaking out, scaring, very scared, all of that. Ends up getting out of jail after a day or two, pleads guilty, gets a 30-day jail sentence, which seems a lot for a 17-year-old kid stealing a lawnmower. But again, these are rural Missouri counties where they got to be tough on crime. So he gets out of jail. Now he's done his time. He's done all the right things, but he gets this jail bill for the 30 days. Well, he doesn't have any money to pay for that, but he's got to come before the judge once a month to either pay $50 towards this, few $100s that he owes, or the judge threatens him with jail again. Well, during this time, he's also being supervised by a private probation company. And guess what? He's being drug tested. He's a 17-year-old kid who smokes pot. So he pees dirty. He gets a drug test. Now the judge sends him back to jail again. And what happens when you go back to jail for that? You get another jail bill. So this kid who stole the lawnmower when he was 17, that was 10 years ago. Well, in 2018 when I wrote about it, that was 10 years ago. He's now still paying that bill, but the bill keeps getting higher. It started as a few $100. Now it's $7,000. He's never going to pay down that bill. Now, because of the court action, he no longer owes that bill. That bill is gone. But at the time when I was writing about it, there were people like him all over the state. And every month the judge would call them before the court. They'd have to get time off work, go to court, hopefully pay $50 or something and make sure they didn't go back to jail, go back to their lives until next month when they owed another $50. They would lose more money taking their time off work than they could afford to pay for the day that they had to show up for hearing anyway. It was a ridiculous process.
Tony, unbelievable. It seems like such an obvious story that nobody touched for such a long time. And, you really made big societal change there. I want to ask you a few questions about the writing itself. What do you think were the most powerful elements in your narratives that compelled people to keep reading and getting involved? You touched on the fact that they were personal stories, obviously, but at the same time, I noticed you only have a limited amount of words to tell a story. And in that, you're trying to educate readers with the law. get them involved with this person, understand the policy, and how do you manage to blend all of that, and what are your priorities when you're creating a compelling narrative?
So part of it in my case was repetition. I write 4 columns a week, and I'm still writing about this topic. So I'm now 3 years into this topic. And so I have to make some occasional assumptions that most of the people reading my work about this particular topic have read some of it before, and they have some basic knowledge. So as I move on through the series, I start to have some assumptions that I build into the writing. And that's, that can be problematic when you get somebody new all of a sudden who doesn't know the whole history. So, you have to just sort of make some decisions along the way. I tried to bite off little pieces. So all of the different people that I'm writing about represented different elements of the problems in the system. So I used some people as an example for why the private probation system is so broken and contributes to the problem. I used some people to talk about how bail at the beginning is part of the problem because it's applied differently to poor people than wealthy people. I used some stories like Corey and Brooke to show the insanity of the level of punishment compared to the kind of crime. And so I tried to pick my characters to tell different parts of the story and then weave them all together. And then in a couple of cases, I would use the example to look at the judge specifically or the prosecutor specifically and why they were a bad actor in a broken system. And so I tried to break it apart that way. It was unique in that I gave a talk to an investigative journalism class at the University of Missouri a few months ago, and I was talking to them about the fact that I was doing much of what an investigative reporter does, but in real time. I was doing, little bits of investigations and adding to it as I went along, as compared to spending 6 months to write one compelling 6,000-word narrative. And so it was a different comparison of the process. There was a reporter at the Missourian, which is the student-run semi-professional newspaper at the University of Missouri, where all the kids in the journalism school end up working on that newspaper. And there was a student there who was following my series and ended up just picking one gentleman, George Ritchie, and making him the focus of a long form, 4,000 or 5,000 word piece on this series that I had been writing for a year. And it was a really good piece, and it was a different way into the same story. And so I was really glad when that happened, in part because I hadn't written a lot about George. He was one of the people who ended up being the names on the Supreme Court case that led to change. But as a writer, it's just a different way to look at it. And as a writer, I'm now going back through all of my work that I broke into small pieces and thinking about it in a different way because I'm trying to write a book on it. And so now I'm struggling with the idea of taking what I'm used to doing, which is breaking into little pieces on a daily deadline, and now thinking of, how do I tell this narrative in book form that gets people to read, 300 or 400 pages.
Tony, I think one of the important elements of getting a story is relationship. Now, obviously, there are going to be people who want to tell you their story, but what kind of relationship do you put into place when you're talking to people who may not be very friendly to you? People in the administration or politicians, or, even actual victims who are afraid of speaking out. What kind of relationship do you cultivate with them?
So the interesting thing is here, the victims were the easy part of the relationship. In fact, a couple of them are back in prison, and I email with them on a prison email site all the time because we just developed. I became a part of their lives. They're a part of my lives. We're Facebook friends. So those of I just continue to talk to a lot of those folks all the time, even when I'm not necessarily writing about them. The victims were easy because they were so happy to have somebody care about their stories. They told me, they're like, somebody actually gets us. Somebody cares about us. They're not throwing us away, treating us like trash. And so they welcomed me into their lives, and told me, all sorts of intimate things about their experience so that I could help bring their stories to life. And so that was, often in journalism, that's the hardest part, getting people to share their stories. In this particular case, they were so happy to have somebody take up their cause that was the easier part. The harder part was probably getting, I didn't talk to judges very much, in part because judges generally won't talk about ongoing cases. But I did talk to judges in the state who sort of helped guide me about how to try to convince the Supreme Court to move this thing forward. One of the interesting things was the state lawmaker who ended up sponsoring the bill. He happens to be my local state lawmaker, and he is not a guy who is a fan of mine. I had written about him twice before this series, both times pretty negatively. Not a fan of his politics, generally speaking, and so it was really interesting when he called, and we had to sort of have this feeling out process where we had to develop some trust, because he really wanted access to the people that I was writing about so that he could better understand the story. And I was still somewhat fearful that I didn't want to be encouraging legislation that might get hijacked and end up doing some damage. And so we really had this interesting feeling out process where we had to develop some trust in the process. And it helps that I had been a state legislative reporter for a long time. I still have deep relationships with some of the folks down there in the lobbying community and former lawmakers and that sort of thing. And so over a period of time in a career, you develop those relationships and you keep as many of them as you can, even people that you're writing about negatively, because you never know when that relationship is going to rebound and you might need them on another story. And so this was one of those stories where it really helped that I had an understanding of the legislative process, and there were folks in the legal community that respected my work and knew of my work and helped guide me, because I was writing about counties that I hadn't spent a lot of time in. And so a lot of folks really helped guide me along the way. And that was one of the consuming pieces of the work, is the relationship development. Because once you allow people to invite you into their lives, and you take those lives and you put them in the paper and everything, that's not a one-time relationship. That's just sort of an ongoing thing. And it's why I continue to write with some of these folks, because it's the folks that I write about in jail and prison that often end up being my greatest advocates, and they guide me to some other really good stories when they happen to meet them when they're in jail and prison and realize, there are innocent people behind bars and they have stories to tell. And oh, by the way, call this guy, he'll listen to you.
Tony, I'd like to open it up to questions right now for a little bit. And anybody have some questions to ask Tony? This is a really rare and wonderful opportunity, folks.
I do.
Michael.
So I was wondering what types of challenges you encountered in, writing and researching about these cases, and how are you able to overcome them or learn from them?
So one of them, the day that I went down to visit Brooke, well, the second day, she had a court date. And I hadn't yet been to Dent County Court. So by the time I went to Dent County Court to sit through one of these hearings, I had already written about this particular judge in a negative fashion 2 or 3 times because she was one of the worst ones in the state for basically putting people in jail because they couldn't afford these jail bills. And so I showed up in court that day, and there's this long line of folks waiting to get in, and metal detector and all that stuff. And when I got up there, the bailiff looked at me and he says, "Are you on the docket?" And I said, "No, I'm a reporter. I'm just here to cover court today." And he says, "Well, hold on there. I don't know that that's okay." And I said, "Yeah, it's okay. Reporters cover court all the time." And he went back to the judge. He had me wait there, and he went back to the judge and came back and said, "Yeah, the judge said you didn't follow proper procedure. You can't come to court today." And I looked at the bailiff, and he actually took me into this small room. And I had this brief moment where I'm like, this is a small little county where they don't always follow civil rights. I may end up in jail today. And I told him, I said, "Look," I said, "the rule that you're talking about is related to photo or video. I don't have my camera and I don't have my phone with me because you don't allow it in this particular courtroom. I have a notebook and I have a pen, and I'm sitting in your courtroom today. The judge is wrong and you're wrong. And if you keep me from the courtroom, I'm going to need time to call my attorney so that we can file a motion to the Supreme Court to force the judge to let me in." And then he went back and talked to the judge for a little bit, and he came back and he pointed in the courtroom and said, "Sit over there." And so he let me in that day. But I was at least a little bit nervous that day that I was going to end up in jail, but I didn't. When you're writing about rural counties and you're making sheriffs mad, judges mad, and prosecutors mad, let's just say I drove a little bit more carefully than I normally do when I was in some of these counties. Some of the folks that I interviewed had outstanding warrants, and so I had to make a decision a couple of different times to meet with people who I knew were breaking the law. And that was a little bit worrisome. There was one interview I did in an apartment that was probably a drug house. You just got to make those decisions. That's where the people are. You got to meet them where they are and hope that they trust you and just not do something to break the law yourself. And so those were a couple of the challenges. Those are probably the biggest ones that I had. And the other one was an internal one. So as I started writing the series, keep in mind, I'm the Metro columnist in St. Louis, and this was a story about rural Missouri. Most of the counties I was writing about don't get the Post-Dispatch. But unfortunately, across rural America right now, there's a real crisis in newspapering. A lot of these folks, counties weren't really being covered by their local newspaper that much. And so I had to convince my bosses that this was something that was of real value. After I wrote probably 4 or 5 columns, I really had to make sure that I was convincing them, hey, this is really something of value that I should be spending my time on. And they ended up supporting me. But that's something that sometimes as a journalist, you've got to do intentionally, is you have to manage up. You have to really sell your story to your editor so that they will get behind you. That was something I had to do a little bit early on in this story.
Does anybody else have questions for Tony?
I have a
Darvin?
question.
Oh, okay, sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering if any change has come from your column, like any change within the system or anything.
Yeah, so 2 things happened because of the series. One, the state legislature passed a law. Well, first, let me back up. So 2 of the cases that I wrote about ended up before the Supreme Court and the Missouri Supreme Court. And they ended up ruling unanimously that it is illegal in Missouri to put people in jail because they didn't pay their jail board bill, their previous bill for a time in jail. And so all of those, basically the Supreme Court said, in these two cases, the judges handled it wrong. Well, almost all across the state, rural judges had been doing it the exact same way. So overnight, it became illegal to do what judges all over the state were doing. And instead, they had to take these jail board bills. If people couldn't afford to pay, they could send them to collection, which is also not bad for poor people. They end up with, bad credit and dealing with other situations, but at least they aren't being threatened with jail time. And that was the distinction that the court made. You have the right to collect this bill. This bill is in statute. If you want to charge it, you can charge it and you can collect it, but it's a civil collection. You can't make it a crime to not be able to pay this bill. So that was the first thing that happened. And that led to a lot of people being let out of jail. And then the next thing that happened was the legislature specifically passed a bill that basically said the same thing the court already ruled, that said you cannot put people in jail, and they expanded it for their inability to pay court fees in general. So both the jail board bill and other court fees, and there's a lot of them. And wherever you live, I guarantee you that there is a problem in your jurisdiction with court fees, where people get charged all sorts of things, often that have nothing to do with the legislative or with the judicial system. And then when they can't afford those fees, sometimes they get their driver's license suspended. Sometimes they get charged with a probation violation for being unable to pay their fees. It's a real problem. And so what the legislature in Missouri said was that you can't put people in jail for that. There is a civil remedy. You can sue them, you can go to collection, but you can't put them in jail for that. So two different actions happened as a result of this. And the other thing that happened, it's a little bit more esoteric, but I wrote so much about this topic that it helped elevate some of the reporting across the country. Lots of different newspapers and magazines have also reported on this issue. And I think I helped elevate that issue nationally. You're starting to see more states. One of the big things you've seen that's related in the last year, it's happened in Texas, in Florida, in Colorado, I think in Oregon. They've passed laws that have said you can no longer suspend driver's licenses for failure to pay court costs. So that's another step in the right direction. I mean, think about it. I've written about some of these folks. You get a court case on whatever it is, you can't afford to pay. The law says when you can't afford to pay that, they suspend your driver's license. Well, you need a driver's license to work. If they suspend your driver's license, you're never going to pay those bills, right? And so the solution ends up being worse than the crime. And so there are millions of people across the country that have lost their driver's license and affected their ability to work because they couldn't afford court costs and fees. And there is now a trend across the nation where that is being reversed.
Darvins, did you have a question for Tony?
Yeah, I had a question. How do you go about validating the stories of inmates and just to make sure they're not like exaggerated or false? And did you get any false stories during your investigation?
So first part of the question, start with the court files. And court files are amazing in most places, because you go back to the original arrest report and the probable cause statement and letters that are written from folks who are incarcerated to their attorneys and to the judge. And sometimes you can get transcripts of actual court cases. And in all the cases that I wrote about, just the simple facts were incredible enough for what it was. People were being arrested for tiny little things and being put in jail for tiny little things. And so you start with that. The court record is always the first place there, in part because journalists have privilege there. We're not going to get sued for libel if we're quoting properly from the court record, and that's that. Then you go to the attorneys, you talk to the prosecuting attorneys in the cases where they'll talk to you about this. You try to find other records to the extent that you can related to these. And in all of the cases related to this debtor's prison series that I was writing about, I really didn't find any cases where folks were leading me wrong, and the court record really helped validate that. Now, that being said, because I write about people in jail and prison, I get a lot of letters from folks in jail and prison. And some of those have some stuff in it that just, doesn't necessarily pass the smell test. So in fact, I'll just show you. I picked up my mail the other day at the office. These are all letters from prison. And, I tend to start with just my own personal smell test on some of those. Does it sound true? Does it ring true? If it's true, is there enough of a news angle there for me to spend my time pursuing this as a story? And then can I get the documents that will validate whether or not it's true? In a lot of cases, when I get stuff from prison, just reading the initial letter doesn't give me enough to make me think, even if true, this doesn't necessarily elevate, When I write about somebody from prison, I particularly want to write about, are they there unjustly, either because they shouldn't have been convicted, or because one of the things I write about a lot are folks who were convicted 10, 20 years ago, when we just had this philosophy as a country that, 3 strikes you're out and everybody's, going to jail, and it doesn't matter how much, little bit of drugs you had, you're going to jail for 20 years, etc. I write about a lot of folks who got sentenced under really poor schemes that all of a sudden we've changed at least a little bit as a society. We understand that our society has some serious racial inequities in terms of how we send people to jail and prison, that particularly as it relates to drug charges, we no longer, many of us no longer recognize that it makes sense for the United States to lead the world in mass incarceration. And so a lot of times I go back and I look at those cases. I've written about a couple of people lately who completely admit everything that they did and they were convicted of. They're not people who are asking to be, believed that they didn't do it. They did it, but should they be sent away 40 years because they held up a convenience store with a BB gun and nobody got hurt? I look at those stories and the simple facts of the case in the court records often, validate the story. Next question.
Yes, next question. Steve, did you want to ask something?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Tony, so much for being with us in our class. I really appreciate you being here with us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I just want to confirm with all the students and our guests, we have everyone's permission to record?
Yes.
Anyone not wanting us to record? Anyone withholding your permission? No, good. Okay, thank you very much, because we do want to share this. Tony, I kind of have a two-part question for you. The first part is this. It's just, how did you come to be a person who cares? Obviously, you care, and you even care about people that a chunk of people in our society have decided, to put away and not think about, or to demonize and make bad. So somehow you've become a person who cares. So maybe this is I don't know where this question goes, but I'm just a little curious. First question is, how did you become a person who cares, particularly about these people that we've, as a society, locked away more than any other society on the planet, like you said? And then the second question comes from my own experience. I've worked in correctional education now for 22 years. I've been in, 8, 9 different jails and prisons working as an educator. And I'm really concerned about the coronavirus. And I'm really concerned about a potential death sentence to the very people that are sent those letters to you. That some of the very people who sent those letters in your hand might not survive this in time because social distancing is so impossible in so many of those places. And anyone who has a compromised immune system or is elderly or has health issues, and it's the 2 million people in America's jails and prisons, I see them all at risk right now. And I see that being part of a potential domino effect that uses up all of the vast resources in many small hospitals and communities and impacts many other lives. So I know those are two very different questions, but the second question, trying to formulate it, is what can journalists do? What can we do to sound an alarm that could be a death sentence for parking violations?
So I want to start with the second question because I've been writing about that. I wrote a column last week about an 80-year-old man named Jim Smith, who is in prison in Pacific, Missouri. He was convicted. His first ever conviction was an assault conviction when he was 77 years old. He is a diabetic who was on a whole lot of medicine that day and got into a spat with a relative, with somebody that he dealt with regularly that had some conflict, and it was a relative. And they were at breakfast at Burger King, and they got into a spat, and the one guy threatened to beat up Jim Smith, and Jim Smith went and got a baseball bat from his car, and they were having a fight in the parking lot, and he hit him in the head. Guy went to the hospital, got stitches, left that day, but he did it. He assaulted him. Case goes to court. 77 years old, Army veteran, never been charged with anything in his life. Prosecutors like, I will not drop this below felony assault, period, end of story. Family decides, okay, we can plead to this. We'll get a pre-sentence report that says put him on probation. It'll be fine. Indeed, that's what happens. They plead guilty. Pre-sentence report says put him on probation. Judge says, no, you hit a guy with a baseball bat, you're going to prison 10 years. This was 3 years ago. So he's in prison in Missouri. He's now 80. He's in completely failing health. He is completely in the eye of the storm as it relates to coronavirus. And his family is asking the governor of Missouri, who has issued no clemencies, no pardons, has released nobody from state prison, to not give this gentleman a death sentence related to the coronavirus. It is a huge problem. In fact, if you lose me, I'll come right back just to show you what a huge problem is. Oh, I can't get to it because it's on a different VPN. I wrote a column about it this morning, another column, and it focuses on, it starts with, there's a professor at Northwestern University who runs sort of an innocence project there. And she tweeted a version of the question that you asked just yesterday. And it said, should poverty be a death sentence? Most people that are in local jails are there because they're poor, either because their charges are offenses related to poverty or because they can't afford bail. So even a lot of the people who are in jail who are there on potentially violent offenses aren't there because they've been convicted of violent offenses. They're there because they can't afford bail. Whereas some of us on this Zoom were we charged with similar crimes, we probably would have access to the sorts of finances that might allow us to get out of jail while a poor person facing the exact same charge would still be in jail. And so that was the nature of her question. Are we going to allow poverty to be a death sentence? And that's going to be one of my columns later this week. I wrote it this morning. I was going to read part of it to you, but I wrote it on my system at work and I'd have to I'd disconnect, so it'd be a problem. But that's a really good question.
We'll get the link to that.
Yeah. So the answer to your question is journalists should be writing about this more, and they should be writing about it in the context of what people are in jail for, and pointing out that a lot of people who are in jail, in prison, even the guilty, are there for crimes that should not be a death sentence. There are several elderly women in Missouri prisons who have been seeking clemency for years. They murdered their husbands 20, 30, 40 years ago, and they were domestic violence victims. And during a time in which this country didn't care much about domestic violence. And so none of that was particularly evidence in those trials. Now they're in their 70s and 80s, and they're in Missouri prison, and they're going to die there. They aren't on death sentences. They're on life without parole or something like that. They've been there 30, 40 years, and all sorts of advocates are trying to get the Missouri governor to say, look, these people are in harm's way. And if they get it, then the staff's going to get it, and the staff's going to take it home, and your community is going to get it. And so it's not just about having sympathy for the folks in prison who might die. It's about the entire communities where these prisons are located. That argument is winning in some states. There are states, Colorado has made some moves. The governor of Illinois has made some moves. Governor of Ohio is thinking about it. Local prosecutors in St. Louis and St. Louis County have released some prisoners, not a huge number, but at least some. So there are moves being made like this all over the country in order to try to save some lives related to this. It's a really important question. So back to your first question. I wrote a column about that too. During the process of working on this series, I was meeting with a woman named Amy Murr. She also is from Dent County. She had spent some time in the jail there, had been put there for the same reasons as others because she couldn't afford to pay her jail bill. And she had a couple of misdemeanor offenses. And she and I were sitting at a bar one night in Salem, and she asked me the question. She said, "Why are you doing this? Why do you care about people like me? I mean, nobody in this town cares about me. They just think I'm, you know, a drunk or a drug addict or, you know, somebody who steals. I'm a criminal. I'm worthless. Why do you care about people like me?" And you know, there's a larger answer about most of us who get into journalism just naturally having a heart to care about other people, and having been in this job for over 30 years writing about, you know, folks in vulnerable communities. You do that enough, you realize that there's a lot of people in our world that don't have a voice, and there's a real value in standing up for them. But my answer to her was one that was personal. And I told her a story about many years ago when I lived in Colorado. I had been through a divorce. The kids are with me over the weekend. My son's got an indoor soccer game. I take him to his soccer game. My older daughter is at home watching two of my younger kids. I have 6 kids. And I'm leaving my son leaves the soccer game with a friend to go spend the night. I'm driving back to go to my house where my kids are, and I get pulled over. And it turns out I had expired tags. And I didn't realize I had expired tags, whatever. So I get pulled over. The officer asked me, "Do you know why you're being pulled over?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Your tags are expired." I said, "Oh, okay. I didn't realize that." And she's like, "I'm going to go back and run your name through the system, and then I'll be back and I'll write you a ticket for that." And I said, "Okay." So she's back there in her cop car for what seems like a really long time. And then all of a sudden another cop car pulls up behind her. And I'm like, that doesn't look good. And they get out and they walk up to me and then, "Mr. Messenger, will you get out of your car, please?" And I said, "Excuse me?" She's like, "Mr. Messenger, you're being placed under arrest. Will you get out of your car, please?" And I said, "Okay." And so I get out of my car and I do the whole, you know, hands on the hood and pat down and get cuffed and hand on top of the head, put in the back of the police car with my hands cuffed behind me. And she said, "Do you know why you're being arrested?" And I said, "No." And she's like, "There's an outstanding warrant for your arrest." And I said, "For what?" And she's like, "I don't know yet. It hadn't come back. As soon as we find out, we'll let you know." So they go back to the other police car where they're running the information. I'm sitting alone in the police car. They come back to me and they said, "Did you know you had an outstanding a speeding ticket in Morrison, Colorado? And I said, no. And she's like, you do. We're going to have to take you in and book you for this warrant. And I said, okay. And she said, do you have any money with you? And I said, yeah, my wallet's on the front seat. Yesterday was payday. I think I got 80 bucks cash in there. She's like, okay, do I have permission to go look and see if you have any money? So she goes up, she grabs the wallet. There's 80 bucks cash in there. She's like, I'm going to take you into the police station. We're going to book you. I'm going to set your bond at 80 bucks. You'll pay and you can go home. And I'm great. So first time in my life, I get booked, I get fingerprinted, I get my picture taken. I'm sitting in a holding cell for about, 20 minutes while they go through all the paperwork. I pay my 80 bucks. I go home to my kids. Problem averted, right? Well, keep in mind, in 2014, I spent most of my year in 2014, well, after August 9th, and then all of 2015 writing about Ferguson and writing about a nature of this same problem that we have all over the country. And in Ferguson and North St. Louis, the story is if you're poor and you're black, you get arrested for small offenses like this and you end up in jail. And they don't ask you if you got 80 bucks for bond. They just let you know what the bond is and you go to jail, and then hopefully you get out eventually. And if you don't pay your ticket, you got a warrant for your arrest, and then you get arrested again and you get more charges on top of that. That was much of the underlying cause of the protests in Ferguson. Separate from police brutality, there was this whole municipal court brutality that had been going on for years, in which particularly poor black people were abused by the judicial system that was trying to get money out of them. I'm a white middle class guy who, if I had been a poor person in rural Missouri or a poor person in North St. Louis County, I would have ended up in jail that night. My kids would have been taken by social services. Lots of bad things would have happened to me if I weren't a middle class white guy who forgot to pay his renew his ticket and pay a speeding ticket. So I told Amy Murr that story, and I said, that's one of the reasons why I do this, because there but the grace of God go I. And that's the nature of why this story is so important. Our criminal justice system doesn't treat all of us the same based on our background, based on how much money we have, based on the color of our skin. It treats many of us much worse than others, and that's not the way it's supposed to be.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Tony. Oh, I'm sorry, Steve. Were you still talking? I'm sorry.
I appreciate your response. I'm very grateful.
Thanks.
Tony, it was so informative today, very insightful and inspiring. I know that we're now at the 1 hour mark, and I know you have writing and deadlines to still meet. Certainly, you're welcome to stay longer. We have a little bit of class time left, but, do you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
So this is a tough time for journalism. Our newspaper is one of many in the country in which we've gotten notice that we're going to have furloughs in the next few months. Probably going to have to take a couple of weeks off without pay. Hopefully, not be laid off. There are a lot of newspapers all over the country that are laying people off. It's tough, but our country needs good, caring journalists more than we ever have. I don't know what it's going to look like in 10 years, in 5 years, in 20 years, but this country still needs our profession, and it needs it badly. And I just always like to encourage young journalists who are looking at the field. I can't imagine doing anything different. I don't think I'll do anything different for the rest of my life. And I wish you nothing but success in the career field. Just go for it and go out there and try to make the world a better place.
Tony, thank you so much. And I did want to point out that Professor Steve Tumolo is my co-instructor and the person responsible for bringing me to Eastern Nazarene College, and that it really was such a privilege to hear you today. Folks, the National Society of Newspaper Columnists was going to have its annual conference in Tulsa this June, and we had to cancel it. And Tony was going to be one of the featured speakers. And so it really is such a privilege to hear you speak today on the very topic that you were going to address with your colleagues in June. But thank you for committing to next year in Birmingham,
Yep.
Alabama.
Thanks for having me, and talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, Tony. Really
You're welcome.
appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Tony.
Thank you.
So anybody would like to discuss what they learned or how they felt or what they thought about Tony's presentation?
I wish I would have asked him.
I think it's, oh, never mind.
Go ahead, Justin, and then we'll get to Bailey.
There's like 20 minutes left, bro. I wish I would have asked him if there was like a specific demographic of, I know that poverty affects many, but I was wondering if he in his research noticed a specific demographic that was struggling a little bit more during his research there. Just out of curiosity.
Well, I know that a lot of his articles, you know, his Pulitzer Prize winning columns, and he wrote extensively about Ferguson in the past. So I think that just generally he's really a champion of poor people, and many African Americans fall into that demographic. And, you know, he mentions and writes about that extensively. But I'm sure it's not limited just to that. Bailey, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on, like, it was very inspiring as someone who I don't know, I like writing about like social justice and certain issues, and I think like he's so passionate about, you know, that topic and like being a voice for people who are in prisons. And I feel like, I don't know, I thought it was just inspiring. You have to be like very passionate about, you know, I don't know.
Well, thanks, Bailey.
Mm-hmm.
Professor, do you have any thoughts, or anybody else?
Well, go ahead, chime in first.
Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so I really liked kind of how he outlined his journey in that field and showed us all the different cases that he had to navigate through, and kind of how he navigated specifically some of the challenges he faced with stepping on different people's toes, but still maintaining the necessary relationship to get information.
Steve, were you going to say something?
No, there's so many take homes. Like towards the end of what he was saying, he was talking about white privilege and how his own white privilege, you know, when a white person pulls over a white person or a white person gets arrested by a white person, the treatment that he got. Well, let's see how much money you have. You know, let's see how much money you have, and we'll set the bond because we trust you, right? I mean, so that's such a privileged stance to be in. He was spot on that, you know, how many people just will never get that chance. So I thought he made it was a powerful personal story he told about how his heart, you know, one way that his heart kept growing open to this group of people. And I really like hearing what you all are saying. I like what you're saying, Bailey, that he's a social justice journalist. And he made a call today. He said, all of us, that I love what he said. He said journalism needs more caring people and good, caring, committed people to enter the field. And even though it's a changing field, it has no lack of advocates and caring writers. So I was just really touched by what he had to say and the time he took. He obviously talks about the importance of relationship for journalism as well. And you could see he's built relationships. That was one day's mail or one trip to the mailbox mail. He had like 6, 7 letters, most of them from jails and prisons. So that's just one day. So he made bonds with people on the underside of our society that very few people connect with. And so I found that very inspiring, and it says something about him, and it says something about how journalism is relationship based.
Any other comments?
I agree with Tumalo. I've never thought about it that way, having it being a relationship-based field. Without relationships, this field would not exist. So,
You know, I'll add in that when Dave Lieber visited us last week, you know, he talked about how sometimes you have to go where the story is, right? You have to experience it. If you want to be able to convey the story to your readers, you have to breathe that air, see what they would see, you know, see what it feels like. And in Tony's case, the power of his narrative was that he met these people and he could convey, you know, their poverty and their desperation and just the incredible injustice of what they were suffering. And it becomes very real for the reader. What I really loved was that it only started with one column in which he wanted to convey to his readers, can you believe this is going on? And then it kind of snowballed into a big series, and it got bigger and bigger, and it led to the Pulitzer Prize. Not only a change of policy and law in Missouri, but now it's starting to have a national effect. You know, at any given time, any one of us could be Tony Messenger. Any other thoughts?
Maybe it's you next, Suzette.
I think in all our own ways and our own style, we, you know, all of us writers, you know, strive to make a difference in some way. You know, we do. Some of us will end up having a much larger reach than others, like Tony. But, you know, I feel that if you make a huge difference just within your sphere of influence, that's huge already. Anybody else?
I was just gonna say, you can really tell how empathetic he is towards like everyone and all different kinds of people, which I think is like very important in the journalism like industry, as he was saying. So I just liked when he was like sharing his story and like why he cares. And he necessarily doesn't have like much like personal experience beforehand with like the different demographics, but it's cool how he just tries to be empathetic towards people, and I just find that really interesting.
What did any of you get out of it today that would make, did anything that he said today make you do something differently, or did it inspire you to take any kind of baby step in any direction?
I would have to
No.
say, oh, who was talking?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. Are you sure?
Yep.
Okay. One of the things that he mentioned was that he was talking about that lady who, you know, ended up getting a $15,000 ticket, right? And that he had wished that he would have tried harder to reach out to her, I think. But her phone number was changing and whatnot. So I guess for me, it's just considering that maybe there's going to be times where I can't reach that person, but I'm going to try my darndest to try to reach that person so that when they hear or see news of themselves, they're not taken back by it. And fortunately, she had a positive response to this. But, you know, you never know how people can take being put out in on the spotlight. They can take it negatively or positively. So doing the best that we can to reach out to the people we're talking about and giving them a fair chance to respond.
Okay. Cooper?
think it was interesting to note that he didn't think it was going to blow up as much as it did. So like, even if we are covering something that we don't think is going to inspire big changes, we should still go for it because it could lead something like that down the road. Because he started with one story about one person, and then it led to laws being changed.
You know, I would also like to add that so much of being a writer or reporter is intuitive. I think that you, like Tony and all of us, you know, you have to really care about what's going on around you. And then you have to build your skills to be able to write effectively in order to convey the importance of that to your readers. And also, one thing that is never really talked about in any class is your own ability of empathy and intuition, right? Tony read the signs. I mean, he initially thought this was going to be one column, right? One column. And he said his big mistake was that he never followed up with anybody. It was the woman, you know, who found him on Facebook and said, look, I've got more people for you to talk to. And then it was like the light bulb went off. Oh my gosh, I might be able to do a series. But it never occurred to him. But when the sign presented itself, when the opportunity presented itself, he saw that clearly for what it could be. And he jumped through that window of opportunity. I mean, how many of us, you know, might say, oh, wow, that was great that she liked what I wrote. Oh, I'm so busy. I got to move on to the next thing. But he actually paused and thought, wow, she's handing me a bunch of people on a platter that could really lead to something much bigger. And he read that sign, followed his gut, and look where it led. So that, you know, my takeaway is that stuff presents itself to you all the time. And you have to just kind of be in the moment and process it and say, why am I being shown this? Why is God showing me this? Is it something that I might be able to run with or do something with or respond to? You know, I think that that's an aspect of writing that doesn't get talked about a lot because it's not necessarily something that you can hold in your hand and see, but I believe it's just as important in really making things happen. Any more comments? Steve, should we talk about Thursdays?
Yeah, remind us again. We got another amazing speaker. Remind us who we're getting.
Well, I think that the